My daughter-in-law told me straight to my face that I couldn't go on the cruise because there was no money, and that I should stay home, so I simply smiled and said it was fine. But by the time they stepped onto the ship, I was already sitting on the deck with a cup of coffee in my hand, enjoying the sea air. My son panicked and shouted that I must be following them and told me to leave. But everything changed when the captain walked up and said something that made both of them go quiet and pale. Before I continue, I just want to ask you to support the channel by subscribing, liking, and telling us in the comments where you're listening from, because it truly helps these stories reach more people. That evening, my small kitchen was filled with the familiar smell of onions and peppers cooking, a smell that always reminded me of better days when the house felt full and warm. I was cooking for myself again, trying not to think about how often I now ate alone, since my world had been reduced to a small guest house behind the big home I had built many years ago. After my husband passed away 10 years earlier, I had put everything in my son Tavorius's name, telling him it was his turn to lead the family, but instead of growing into that role, he slowly started living only to satisfy his wife Kenyatta. Now I stayed out of the way, trying not to be noticed like something old that people keep around but no longer value. That evening, the door opened and cold air rushed in as both of them walked inside, and while my son avoided looking at me and kept touching his jacket nervously, Kenyatta stood there acting like the whole world was on her shoulders, making it clear that something was wrong. She threw her coat over a chair without even saying hello and let out a long, tired sigh, as if she were the only person in the world carrying everyone's problems. My son started to speak and said we needed to talk, but his voice shook and he kept glancing at his wife like he needed her approval. She quickly took over, calling me by name and saying there was a serious problem, using that sweet fake tone that always made me uncomfortable. She reminded me about the roof and the leak in the east wing, and of course I remembered because just a week earlier I had given them $15,000 from my savings, nearly all I had left, because they said the repairs couldn't wait. Then she explained that the costs had gone up, that they found more damage inside, and that everything was worse than expected, and I could tell they were building up to something. I asked calmly what all this meant, and that's when she said they couldn't take me on the cruise because the money was gone, pretending to be sorry while clearly relieved. My son apologized and said it would be better if I stayed behind to watch the house and garden, and his wife agreed, saying someone had to keep things in order. I looked at her and felt strangely calm, not angry, not hurt, just clear-minded, and that's when I noticed the expensive, shiny bracelet on her wrist as her sleeve slipped down, and in that moment, everything started to make sense. As her sleeve slipped, I saw a slim white gold bracelet covered in small diamonds, the kind you don't mistake for cheap jewelry, and I recognized both the style and the store, which meant it cost far more than the repairs she had just complained about. She noticed my eyes on it and quickly pulled her sleeve back down, but the truth was already clear to me. I simply said, in a calm voice that surprised even me, that if there was no money, then there was no money and they should go and I would look after the place. They looked at each other, clearly expecting me to argue or beg, but when I didn't, they seemed more relieved than worried. She suddenly dropped the sad act, said they needed to pack because they were leaving early, and added that they wouldn't eat because they were preparing for the trip. Then they walked out and left me alone in the quiet kitchen. I finished my usual chores, cleaned up, and later took the trash out, and that's when I noticed a crumpled piece of thick paper had blown out of the big bin near the gate. Something about it made me stop, and when I smoothed it out under the streetlight, I saw it was a bill from a travel company, dated the day before, showing a luxury suite booking on a river cruise for $15,000, paid in full, and in that moment, everything around me seemed to stand completely still. The noises of the night, the moving leaves and a faraway dog, all seemed to disappear, and all I could see were the numbers on that paper. 15,000, the exact amount I had handed over just 3 days earlier. It was my money, and in that instant I understood there was no roof problem, no hidden damage, and no real emergency. Only a lie used to steal my savings so they could enjoy a luxury trip while leaving me behind like an unwanted responsibility. Strangely, I didn't feel weak or shaky at all. Instead, my heart began to beat in a calm, strong rhythm, and any tears that might have come were replaced by a clear, cold determination. They had forgotten who I was before I lived a quiet life in this house, and they had forgotten that the St. James name once carried real weight in business. I folded the bill, put it in my pocket, went back inside, and from a hidden drawer took out an old leather address book with a single number I hadn't used in years. I made the call, waited as long as it took, and when the man on the other end finally answered, I told him exactly who I was and what I needed, and a minute later, standing in the dark bedroom, I heard something that made me smile for the first time in days. I soon learned that the company owning the Gilded Magnolia wasn't just some distant partner but a branch of a business we had bought years ago, back when I was still in charge, and according to the files Cyprien found, my quiet share in the company reached all the way there too, which meant I wasn't begging for a favor at all but simply getting ready to step onto a ship that was partly mine. The next 2 days moved in a strange, familiar rhythm, calm, focused, and precise. While Tavorius and Kenyatta rushed around the house arguing over luggage, I locked myself in the bathroom with the water running and handled everything by phone, and even my old lawyer Solomon, who first tried to slow me down, ended up laughing and agreeing to prepare the papers and notify the captain, a man I remembered from long ago as honest and dependable. In between calls, I opened the hidden cedar closet and took out clothes from a life Kenyatta had never seen, choosing a fine linen suit and a silk scarf instead of my usual worn things, because if I was going to face them I would do it properly. On the morning they were leaving, the house was full of shouting and panic, and I stepped onto the porch in my plain gray coat, holding an old travel bag as a decoy, and called my son's name. Watching him jump in surprise as if he had just remembered I was still there, that he snapped at me to hurry because they were already late. So I calmly told him I wouldn't be staying home and that I was going to help Sister Alpha for a few days since she wasn't feeling well, and that I'd be back around the same time they returned, which made Kenyatta smile in a way she didn't even try to hide, telling us to lock up and save on bills before rushing him into the car. And they drove off without a hug or a second look while I stood there until their lights disappeared and quietly wished them a good trip. About half an hour later, a long black car arrived and a polite driver opened the door and said the captain was waiting for me. And as I settled into the soft seat, I let my plain coat slip away, fixed my scarf, put on my glasses, and saw in the mirror not a woman to be ignored but someone in charge of her own story again. The ride to the port was smooth and quick, and when we arrived I saw crowds, noise, and long lines, but my driver went straight past all of that to a private entrance where the gate opened at once, and we drove right up near the ship. Through a fence I spotted my son struggling with heavy bags and Kenyatta waving her arms at staff, both of them stressed and unaware that our paths were about to cross again in a very different way. They looked almost sad, trying to act important with a trip paid for using money that was never truly theirs. The driver opened my door, and as I stepped onto the pier, the warm river air hit my face, thick and heavy, and for the first time in days I felt light and free. 2 young crew members in spotless uniforms hurried over, greeted me by name, and gently took my small bag, saying the captain had already arranged for everything to be sent to the owner's suite and asking me to follow them. Without even glancing back toward the fence where my son and his wife were still arguing, I walked onto the ship, and the moment the suite door closed behind me, the noise of the port disappeared and was replaced by calm and quiet. The rooms were large and beautiful, but I went straight to the big screen on the wall and turned it on, and soon I saw exactly what I expected. Tavorius and Kenyatta walking down the hallway, tired but excited, stopping at the luxury room I had unknowingly paid for, and when they went inside I switched to the inside camera and heard her shout in delight as she admired the big bed and the balcony, completely unaware that someone else was already watching. She spun around the bathroom in excitement, her bright dress flashing against the light-colored walls, while Tavorius dropped into a chair, wiped his face, and smiled like everything in life had gone exactly as planned. He asked if all of this trouble had been worth it, and Kenyatta rushed to the table where a chilled bottle was waiting, telling him they needed to celebrate their new freedom right away. The cork popped, the glasses were filled, and some of the drinks spilled onto the carpet, but they didn't even notice as they raised their glasses and laughed, talking about how clever they had been. They joked about how I was probably still standing there with my old bag, believing every word they had told me, and Kenyatta even mocked the way she imagined I walked and talked, making both of them laugh even harder. Tavorius added that I was likely at home feeling sorry for myself while they were living like important people, and they both seemed very pleased with that idea. Watching from my screen, I felt no anger, only a cold, clear understanding of who they really were, and I quietly finished my coffee without a single shake in my hand. After that, Kenyatta said she wanted to see the restaurant and make sure the staff knew how to behave, and they left the room in a hurry, and in the hallway I saw her snapping her fingers at a worker to move aside, already acting like she owned the entire ship. I lifted the cabin phone and dialed a short, private number, then calmly gave my instructions to the captain, who answered in a sharp, disciplined voice. I told him that the guests from room 404 had stepped out and that it was time to move to the next step, to carefully pack their things without any special treatment and to cancel their access cards. and he replied that everything was already prepared and would be handled right away. I leaned back and waited, knowing the plan was now in motion, and about an hour later the ship pulled away from the dock as the sun turned the river into a wide path of gold. The cameras showed my son and his wife bothering a bartender and sending drinks back, and when they finally returned to their room to get ready for dinner, I turned the sound on and watched Tavorius try his card on the door, only to see the light flash red again and again. He wiped the card, tried once more and even pulled on the handle, but nothing opened, while Kenyatta complained that she needed to get inside. Just then a senior crew member appeared with calm manners and explained, after checking his tablet, that there had been a booking change and that the suite was reserved for priority owners, so their stay there had been cancelled and their bags had already been moved to a different room that matched their current reservation level. Leaving both of them standing there in shock and disbelief, he passed two simple metal keys with heavy brass tags to Tavorius, each marked with the number 0012. Kenyatta looked at them with doubt and refused to take them at first, asking sharply where that room even was. The steward calmly explained it was on the lower deck, near the engineering area at the back of the ship. That was enough to set her off. She raised her voice so loud it echoed down the hallway, shouting that they were being pushed into the worst place possible and demanding to see the manager or even the captain. The steward pointed toward the VIP sun deck and said politely but firmly that the decision could not be changed. Furious, Kenyatta grabbed the keys and tossed them at her husband, then dragged him toward the stairs, promising lawsuits and trouble for everyone involved. They rushed up the steps in a loud storm of anger, while I sat upstairs in a comfortable chair, quietly enjoying the evening, my book and a cup of espresso. As their footsteps grew closer, I calmly turned a page and took another sip. The door burst open with a heavy crash that startled the birds outside, but I didn't even look up right away. Kenyatta's voice cut through the peaceful air as she shouted for the manager, and Tavorius added that they had paid good money and deserved better. They stormed onto the deck, ready to argue and cause a scene, looking around for someone to blame. But there was no crowd, no staff waiting to argue with them, only me sitting at the main table under the shade and a waiter standing quietly nearby with a coffee pot, watching everything unfold in silence. They froze instantly. At first all they could see was a silhouette, a woman in a pristine white linen suit, a wide-brimmed hat and oversized dark glasses that hid half her face. She exuded calm, effortless confidence, the kind that only comes from generations of privilege. Kenyatta stepped forward, ready to scream again, but the words caught in her throat. I slowly lifted my glasses and looked straight at them. The silence on the deck felt heavier than any shout. Mama," Tavorius muttered, his face slack, jaw dropped, looking utterly stunned. Kenyatta's face shifted from pale to red, anger flaring in spots across her neck. "You," she shrieked, disbelief and fury mixed in every syllable. "What are you doing here?" I placed my glasses neatly on the table beside my book and glanced at my watch. "Just having coffee, Kenyatta, and enjoying the view, until your shouting ruined it." Tavorius stepped forward, fists clenched, fear turning into anger, the defensive stance of a man cornered by his own assumptions. "Are you stalking us?" he barked, spitting slightly. "Have you lost your mind, old woman? Get out. How did you even get here? Who paid for this?" "It's our money," I said calmly. The truth hit Kenyatta like a lightning strike. She sprang toward the table, eyes burning with a wild fury. "You stole our money. You didn't pay for repairs. You bought a ticket to ruin our vacation." "It was my money, Kenyatta," I replied evenly. "The money I saved for years, which you two took under the pretense of broken beams." She lost all control, lunging at me, fingers reaching for my jacket as if to shake me out of my chair. "Get out of here. Security. Throw her off." Her long nails almost touched me when a voice like a ship's horn cut through the air. "Remove your hands." It wasn't a yell. It was a command that allowed no hesitation. Kenyatta recoiled as if struck and Tavorius slumped, defeated. From the bridge doors, Captain Emmer Thaddeus appeared, immaculate in his dress uniform with gold-striped sleeves and a peaked cap, the presence alone halting their rage that he looked like an unmovable wall. Behind him, two large security officers stood like sentinels. Thaddeus walked past the stunned Tavorius without a glance and positioned himself between me and Kenyatta, his shadow engulfing her completely. "Remove your hands from the owner of this vessel," he said, his deep voice full of authority and barely hidden contempt. Tavorius blinked, struggling to process what he had just heard. "Owner," he stammered, his voice breaking. He tried to laugh nervously, pointing at me. "Captain, you must be mistaken. This is my mother. She's just a retiree, living in a small guest cottage, barely has money for tea." Thaddeus slowly turned to Tavorius, his gaze icy. "Mr. St. James," he said in a tone that cut like steel, "let me make this perfectly clear. Madame Oilia St. James holds the controlling interest in Riverflow Holdings. She owns this company, that port, and this riverboat from keel to stack." Tavorius swayed, his mind reeling, looking from me to the captain and back, the world he thought he controlled crumbling around him. "That can't be," Kenyatta whispered, clutching the back of a chair to keep standing. "She has nothing. She gave it all to us." Thaddeus continued with ruthless precision, leaving no room for doubt. "You are not at a resort. You are in Madame Oilia's private space, behaving as uninvited guests who have trespassed and acted aggressively." The weight of his words hit them like a hammer. Not just that I had wealth, but that they had tried to steal 15,000 from someone who controlled millions. They had taken petty change from a dragon they thought was harmless. Tavorius' legs gave out beneath him and he collapsed, hitting the deck with a dull thud. Kenyatta fell beside him, her mouth opening and closing silently, powerless as the truth sank in. Their arrogance and sense of superiority vanished completely, leaving only raw fear in the presence of a woman calmly stirring her coffee. "Emmer," I said quietly, not even glancing at the trembling couple, "the coffee's getting cold. Sit down. We need to discuss the route. Take them out of my sight." I returned to my cup as security lifted them by their arms like heavy bags. Tavorius mumbled incoherently, dragging his feet along the deck, while Kenyatta had gone completely rigid, frozen in a statue of shock and disbelief. They weren't thrown off the ship, at least not yet. Emmer understood my intentions without a word. They would face a unique punishment, confined with uncertainty. They were escorted to cabin 012, directly above the propeller shaft, with no portholes and a constant vibration that made even a glass of water inch across the nightstand. It was the perfect place for reflection. I made no sound all day, letting them stew in fear, anxiety, and their own imagination. I pictured Kenyatta pacing the small cabin, hissing at Tavorius, trying to justify their actions. "We only borrowed it. We would have paid it back. She's a mother, she'll forgive." They clung to the hope that my long-trampled maternal heart would soften. By 8 p.m. I sent a steward with an envelope of thick cream paper, gold-embossed, containing an invitation to dinner. Private dining room, the Romanov, 8:30 p.m. I arrived early. The room was small and intimate, perfect for serious conversations with oak-paneled walls, dim sconce lighting and heavy dark emerald velvet drapes. I took the head of the table, a plate of baked trout and a glass of dry Riesling before me. At exactly 8:30 the doors opened and they entered hesitantly, unsure what awaited them. Kenyatta had managed to change into a sleek black cocktail dress, clearly hoping a somber, refined look would earn her sympathy. Tavorius, on the other hand, wore the same rumpled blazer, looking tired and defeated. They resembled schoolchildren summoned to the principal's office, guilty, anxious, but still clinging to a flicker of hope that I would forgive and smooth things over. "Mama," Tavorius began, stepping cautiously toward the table, "we're so glad we can sit and talk calmly." I gestured to the two chairs opposite me and they hesitantly sat. Kenyatta forced a smile, though the corners of her lips quivered. "Mother Oilia," she said, fidgeting with a napkin, "what a terrible misunderstanding today. We were shocked, you understand? The renovation nerves, we only wanted what was best. We didn't mean to worry you with our problems." I continued cutting a piece of fish, the only sound the soft clink of silverware against porcelain. They waited for menus, for waiters, for wine, but the table offered nothing. No forks, no glasses, only polished wood and a thick gray folder in the center. "Where's the dinner?" Tavorius asked, confused. "You will not be served dinner," I said, putting down my fork, dabbing my lips and meeting my son's gaze with a calm, exhausted look. "Have you eaten enough, Tavorius? You've been eating at my expense for the last 5 years. I think you're full." He stammered, trying to feign ignorance, eyes drawn to the folder. Slowly I pushed it toward them. Tavorius opened it with trembling hands while Kenyatta craned forward. The first page revealed a spreadsheet filled with numbers, dates, and red ink notes. "That's not a cruise bill," I said, taking a quiet sip of wine. It's a full forensic audit of my personal accounts and the accounts I allowed you access to via power of attorney. Tavorius turned pale, nearly blending into the tablecloth, and Kenyatta swallowed hard. Did you really think I didn't notice? I asked softly, each word sharp as stone. Receipt for hypertension medication. $400 withdrawn $1,500. Kenyatta's voice quivered. Mama, prices went up? She tried to explain that the pharmacy was expensive, but the truth was simple. The extra money went to Kenyatta's beauty treatments. I didn't even need to look at the papers anymore because I already knew every line by heart. Groceries, I said calmly. You brought me a small bag of basic food, but every week you wrote down 1,000 as help for mama. And you even paid for gas for your big car with my card. Tavorius whispered that it must be a mistake, keeping his eyes on the table. And then the roof repair, I continued without mercy. 15,000. The peak of your greed. You didn't just take that money, you took it while looking me in the eye and telling stories about broken beams, knowing it was my last safety net. Kenyatta panicked and started saying they only borrowed it and meant to return it because of problems at work. But I struck the table once, sharply, and the room fell silent. I was patient, I said quietly, and that calm scared them more than any shouting. I waited for you to remember who paid for your house and your education, but you were never satisfied. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting go of the last hope I had for this family, then pointed to the folder. Check the last page. An hour ago I canceled all your access. Your cards are blocked, the joint accounts are frozen, and an investigation has begun. Tavorius looked at me in shock, asking if I was really doing this, but I continued, you have no money left, not even for a small purchase. Kenyatta jumped up in panic, saying we were family and asking how they would survive in the middle of the river. I looked at her calmly and said, the same way I will, simply and honestly. Then I called the staff and ended the meeting. Dinner is over. Go back to your cabin and rest. Tomorrow will be a very long day for you. The doors opened and the head of security stepped through. Tavorius and Kenyatta hunched over, clutching the folder of their shame as they shuffled toward the exit. They disappeared into the dark lower decks, leaving me alone in the glow of the lamps, with cold fish on my plate and the bitter taste of victory that somehow felt like ashes. The next morning arrived with a thick, milky fog rolling across the river. I sat in the carrium on the upper deck, a glass-enclosed veranda where palms and orchids created a small tropical illusion amid the chill of an American autumn. A cup of herbal tea warmed my hands, a plaid blanket rested on my knees, and the quiet seemed absolute, though I knew better. Several decks below, in cramped cabin 012 above the propeller, a storm was raging. Security reported screaming through the night. Stripped of money, status, and their illusion of control, Tavorius and Kenyatta turned on each other, each blaming the other for their misery. The door to the solarium creaked and a quiet, trembling voice broke through. Mother Oilia. I set my cup down. The clink of china sounded sharp in the silence. Turning slowly, I saw Kenyatta. She looked completely different. The haughty stance and predatory glare were gone. Her hair was messily tied in a bun, her face bare, revealing red, swollen eyes. She stood at the doorway, wringing her hands nervously like a child caught doing something wrong. Hey, she whispered. I nodded toward the wicker chair across from me. Sit, Kenyatta. She moved hesitantly, perching on the edge, hunching over as if trying to disappear into herself. I couldn't sleep, she began, a single tear sliding down her cheek. Tavorius, he went off the rails. He was screaming, blaming me for everything. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing, and I watched quietly, detached like a theatergoer who already knows the ending. Oilia, you have to listen, she pleaded, lifting her hands to look at me. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know the scale. Tavorius always said it was his money, bonuses, deals that went well. I believed him. He's the man, the provider. How could I have known he was stealing from his own mother? She leaned forward, trying to meet my eyes. I'm a victim too, you understand? He forced me to live a certain way, to buy, to wear, to fit in. I just wanted to be a good wife. And now you think I'm a monster. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I love you, Mama. I always wanted a real family. But Tavorius, he turned me against you. He said horrible things, built walls between us, made up the roof story. I told him we couldn't take your last savings and he laughed, saying, You wouldn't understand anyway. I picked up the teapot and poured her a cup of steaming herbal tea. Drink, I said evenly. Your throat must be dry from so many words. She clutched the cup with both hands as if it were a lifeline. Thank you, you're a saint, Oilia. I don't deserve your kindness. I just want you to know I'm leaving him. As soon as we return, I'll file for divorce. I'll work, I'll pay back every penny. Just don't cut me out of your life. Give me a chance to make amends. She looked at me with pure, devoted eyes. If I hadn't known her for 10 years, I might have believed her. Her performance was perfect. The wronged, repentant wife. I sipped my tea, feeling its warmth, and said thoughtfully, You are very convincing, Kenyatta. Tavorius really is weak, clay in someone else's hands. Her face brightened instantly, convinced she had won me over. Yes, exactly, she said. He's weak and I just got caught up in his influence, she said, but I calmly set my cup down and picked up the tablet lying near the plate of cookies. I explained that this ship uses very modern security systems, especially in the lower areas near the engines and crew cabins where they were staying, and I watched her freeze as hope slowly drained from her face. I went on in the same calm, almost teaching tone, saying that because of safety rules and constant engine noise, audio recording runs all day and night in those cabins in case of emergencies or disputes. Then I tapped the screen and played a file. The peaceful room was suddenly filled with a sharp, angry voice. Hers, not the gentle one she was using now, but the real one from the night before, shouting at my son, calling him weak and useless, while he tried to calm her down and begged her to lower her voice. On the recording, she didn't care who heard, saying that as soon as they reached land she would find lawyers, claim I wasn't in my right mind, send me away to a cheap state facility, sell the house and keep the money, because she wasn't going to lose her comfortable life over him being afraid of his mother. I stopped the recording and the last cruel words seemed to hang in the air between the glass walls. Kenyatta went completely pale, as if all the strength had left her at once, her mouth opening without a sound, all her stories about love and sacrifice falling apart in a second. I looked at her without anger, only with deep, tired disappointment, and quietly asked if that was really the plan. She started shaking her head, pushing her chair back, trying to say it was just emotions and she didn't mean it, but I stopped her and closed the tablet. I told her she never wanted a family, only comfort and money, and that to her I had always been nothing more than a walking wallet who had lived longer than she expected. Then I stood up and she shrank back in her chair as if she finally understood that her act was over. Sponsorship cancelled, I said firmly, telling her to go back to her husband and make the most of the little time they had left before we arrived. I turned toward the window to show the conversation was over, and behind me I heard shaky breathing, a quiet sob and then fast, uneven footsteps moving away. Outside, trees passed by in soft colors, but all I could really see was my own reflection in the glass, calm, serious and finally at peace. Less than an hour later, the quiet of my private library was shattered by loud voices and the sound of a struggle. I was sitting in a leather chair reviewing reports when the doors burst open, and Kenyatta rushed in, dragging a ship's doctor by the sleeve, her face no longer tearful but filled with hard determination, while Tavorius stumbled in behind her, confused and breathless. She shouted for the doctor to hurry and claimed I was a danger, pulling him so hard his coat almost tore, while he tried to calm her and remind her she couldn't just storm into this area. Tavorius pointed at me from a distance and claimed I was confused and making things up, saying I thought I owned the ship and had taken their money, while Kenyatta added more accusations and demanded the doctor give me something to make me stop talking. I quietly took off my glasses and set them on the papers in front of me, already understanding their simple and desperate plan. Since they couldn't talk me into anything and couldn't scare me anymore, they had decided to try to make everyone believe I wasn't in my right mind, that if a doctor officially recorded acute psychosis or delirium, next of kin could gain temporary guardianship, giving them control over my accounts, my signature and authority over me. This was their last desperate hope. Doctor, you have to document her condition. Kenyatta shouted, spitting words in fury. We need a medical report for guardianship. We must protect her assets before she gives them away in a fit of madness. She doesn't even know where she is. The doctor finally freed his sleeve from her iron grip, straightened his coat, adjusted his stethoscope and stepped forward. Tavorius looked at him with expectation. Ask her, doctor. Ask whose ship this is. You'll see for yourself. The doctor sighed, removed his thin glasses, wiped them with a handkerchief and looked up at me. Sparks of amusement danced in his eyes, despite his attempt at a professional mask. "Good afternoon, Madame St. James," he said calmly. "How is your blood pressure today?" I answered, smiling slightly, "Perfectly normal. 120/80. The river air helps, though some passengers are far too noisy." Silence filled the room. Kenyatta froze, mouth open. Tavorius blinked, stunned. The doctor then turned to them, his gentle tone gone. His gaze hardened, sharp as steel. "Young people," he said icily, "I have been Oilia's personal physician for 22 years. I oversaw her rehabilitation after her husband's stroke. I manage her cardiology. I know every detail of her body and mind. You claim she has dementia? But her last MRI shows her cerebral vessels are in better condition than either of yours. Her mind is sharper than any captain on this river. Your hysteria suggests you need a psychiatric evaluation, not her." Kenyatta slumped against the doorframe, head in her hands, whispering, "But we didn't know." "How? You didn't know?" I interrupted, staying seated in my chair. "Because you never cared. For 20 years, Dr. Beauchamp came to our home every month. Did you ever ask whose car was at the gate? Or what medicine I take? No. You only thought about yourselves." The doctor pulled a notepad from his pocket, jotted something quickly, tore off the sheet and handed it to Tavorius. "What is this?" the son asked, staring blankly at the paper. "A bill," the doctor said politely. "For a false emergency call, after hours, of a senior specialist for an unplanned mental health consultation. The patient's mental health is perfect. My time, however, is not free." Tavorius looked at the number and went pale. $500, he muttered. "We have no money, the cards are blocked." "That is not my problem," Dr. Beauchamp said with a shrug, turning away. "The bill will be added to your cabin account. If it isn't paid before you reach the port, the authorities will handle it. Good day." He winked at me and left, quietly closing the door. I was left alone with them, two broken, defeated figures among the luxury they had long desired but could never truly claim. "Leave," I said, putting my glasses back on and returning to my reports, then closed the door behind them. Tavorius pulled Kenyatta along and she moved like a zombie, staring straight ahead. The lock clicked, final and absolute, the sound marking the end of their illusions. I looked out the window as the shore drew near. Ancient cypress trees and a weathered landing appeared, the end of their journey and the start of mine. The riverboat shuddered and bumped against the rubber fenders of the dock. The hum of the engines faded, replaced by wind rustling the willows and crows calling overhead. We had arrived at Cottonwood Point, a remote but hauntingly beautiful landing in rural Arkansas, miles from any city, reached by broken roads. I stood at the main exit on the lower deck, wearing my camel hair coat and silk scarf, flanked by the head of security with arms crossed. A minute later, Tavorius and Kenyatta appeared, rumpled, exhausted and twitchy. Tavorius forced a smile, a flicker of naive hope in his eyes, as if he believed that after all this, I might reward him. "Mama, we're here. Is this an excursion?" he asked uncertainly. "You've decided to forgive us and take us to see the old cotton fields? They say the history here is powerful," Tavorius said, trying to sound casual. Kenyatta said nothing, her eyes fixed wearily on the open gangway. "This is your stop," I said bluntly, refusing his smile. "Get out." "Oh, great," Tavorius muttered, forcing a nod, trying to appear cheerful. "Let's take a walk, get some air. It'll be good for Kenyatta. She's completely exhausted. We'll just grab our jackets. You don't need to go back to the cabin," the head of security interrupted, his voice like a hammer. "Mr. St. James, Mrs. St. James, exit." They froze. The cold autumn wind hit their faces, but they barely noticed. "What do you mean, exit?" Kenyatta whispered. I nodded toward the gangway. "Go. You are expected." Under the silent, heavy gaze of security, they stepped onto the metal gangway, moving slowly, unsure, glancing back as if I might laugh and tell them it was a joke. When their feet hit the cracked, damp concrete of the landing, reality hit. Right in front of them, their 4 oversized plastic suitcases, the ones they had dragged aboard in New Orleans, were huddled together. Next to them lay a folder with the unpaid doctor's bill and the eviction notice. Tavorius froze, staring at the suitcases, then at the empty landing. No taxis, no buses, just a lone dog sniffing a bollard. Then he looked up at me leaning on the railing. "Mama," he squealed, voice cracking. "What does this mean? Are you leaving us here?" Kenyatta clutched a suitcase handle like it was her lifeline. "You have no right," she wailed, stomping her foot. "This is the middle of nowhere. We have no money, the cards are blocked. How will we get home? It's 500 miles. I looked down at them from above. From this height they seemed tiny, not the predators who poisoned my life but insignificant, scrambling insects. The wind whipped my hair but I felt warm for the first time in years. My voice carried across the landing, strong and steady, amplified by the river. "You told me before leaving, no money. Stay home. You said you couldn't afford a ticket for your mother," I said slowly, letting each word sink in. "Well, now you have no money and you can't afford to continue this journey, Mommy." Tavorius rushed toward the gangway, but the deckhands had already begun raising it. Metal scraped against concrete with a sharp clang. "Forgive us. We'll pay everything back. Don't leave us here. We'll die." Kenyatta cried. "You are young and healthy," I answered evenly. "You have hands, feet, and the ability to move. Find work, hitchhike, figure it out. After all, you've always said you're self-made, that everything you achieved was on your own. Here's your chance to prove it without my money." The gangway locked into place with a thunderous crash. The gilded Magnolia's engines roared, churning the dark river into frothy waves, and the boat slowly pulled away from the dock. "Stop. Stop. You old witch." Kenyatta shouted, finally realizing pleading was useless. She hurled a shoe at the ship, which splashed harmlessly into the water. "I curse you. You'll die alone." I didn't respond. Their screams faded into the distance, swallowed by the river and wind. On the empty, windswept pier I saw them. Two tiny figures stranded with a pile of useless luggage without a penny to their names. I turned away from the shore, leaving the past behind on the concrete. Emmerich approached, removing his cap, looking at me with a questioning glance. "Course for New Orleans, Madame St. James, returning to schedule?" I looked toward the widening river, the horizon stretching endlessly, the clouds parting to let sunlight through. "No, Captain," I said, a small smile tugging at my lips. "To hell with the schedule. Plot course north, Emmerich, all the way to our headquarters in Minnesota." His eyes lit up with surprise, a spark of adventure flashing across them. "That's another 2 weeks of sailing," he said. "Did we forget something there?" "I've always dreamed of seeing the fall foliage along the upper Mississippi," I replied, breathing in the crisp, sweet air as the river carried us onward. "They say when the maples change, the riverbanks look like a sea of fire." I had postponed seeing it for 30 years. First work, then a husband, then a son, then grandchildren who never came. Enough delays. I felt something swell inside me, long forgotten and powerful. It wasn't just a smile, it was pure, unstoppable joy. I threw my head back and laughed, a loud, clear laugh that carried over the Mississippi, startling the gulls. I laughed at my own past blindness, at their greed, at life's strange twists. I laughed from sheer happiness. I had money, I had a ship, and an entire river of time stretched before me. My life wasn't ending, it was just beginning. Did you enjoy this story? I'd love to know which city you're listening from. Let's meet in the comments. If you enjoyed it, you can support me with a super thanks so I can keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you for your kind support. On the screen you'll see 2 new life stories I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel, so don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next story with love and respect.